Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Villa, and I'm pleased to be joined today by former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang. Mr. Yang, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. It's great to see you, Lisa. Last time I saw you, we were on the trail in New Hampshire, I believe. Is that correct?
More than a year ago now, when the world was very different. Let's start with two of the subjects that have been dominating the news the last several weeks and months. First, the racial justice protests that have broken out in the wake of George Floyd's death in Minnesota. I'm wondering what you think the federal government needs to be doing in order to combat the systematic racism that clearly exists prevalently throughout the United States.
The federal government needs to do much, much more around this issue of police brutality and injustice. I'm a numbers guy, and so I started trying to dig into measures of the scope and magnitude of this problem, and it's massive. We have 1,000 people die in police involved shootings every year that we know about. The data is actually unclear, despite the fact that police departments are supposed to report this data. And you have municipal police departments paying out $1 billion a year or more in civil judgments against police officers based upon police brutality and misconduct. So this is a massive problem, and our federal government needs to make huge changes in order to rein this problem in. So some of the things that are being proposed at the congressional level right now are the right moves, banning chokeholds. We need to have more Department of Justice oversight, because the fact is local district attorneys do not want to run afoul of local law enforcement. They work with them every single day to prosecute cases. And so then to have them turn around and say, hey, there's this bad cop that we need to get rid of or bring to justice, it's not realistic. Kamala Harris, who's been in that seat, said the same thing. So we need more federal oversight. We need to demilitarize our police departments. We've literally sent billions of dollars in military hardware to them free of charge. So we need massive changes, and the federal government is the only entity that can realistically make those changes. The American people are nearly unanimous on the need for these changes, and I certainly hope that Congress starts moving the George Floyd Act through to think bigger about how we can solve this problem. And then there's the bigger landscape of racial inequities, which to me, it's even more pervasive than this police brutality issue. We need to reshape our economy so that it works for more people who right now are being pushed aside or left behind.
As you've already highlighted, this is a huge issue that a lot of people are having discussions about at home. I know that you have a young family, and I'm wondering what some of the conversations on the topic of racial injustice have looked like at home for you.
My boys are very young; they're 7 and 4. The 7-year-old is autistic, so they're somewhat oblivious, honestly, which is kind of a blessing right now. So we've talked to them about the coronavirus. That's why they were pulled out of school, obviously. We have talked to them about George Floyd and the fact that that Black people in our country are unfortunately treated differently and subject to violence that other groups are not. Do they understand these things? I'm not sure, but it did seem important that we at least try to expose them to it, given the fact that this is happening in their country, in their world.
You raised racial inequalities already. I wonder, would you support the calls for reparations?
It's clear that this country was built on the backs of slaves and that we owe them a massive debt. And I'm for HR 40, the bill that explores what reparations would look like. To me, there's an intermediate step where we need to reshape our economy so that it's working for all of us. And then we should move directly towards considering and weighing reparations. But we're facing an economic catastrophe right now that faces all Americans, unfortunately, not just descendants of slaves, where we've lost 40 million jobs that we know about, and economists project that 42% of those jobs are gone for good. So you're looking at 17, 18 million jobs gone forever. The Great Recession at its peak cost us 8.8 million jobs. So you're looking at 2 times the Great Recession in perpetuity as far as the eye can see. This is what we need to address immediately before we can look at digging into some of the even um, deeper historic inequities that have existed in this country, unfortunately, for generations.
Just to hone in on that a little bit more, your signature proposal during the campaign was the universal basic income proposal of giving Americans $1,000 a month. Why are you a proponent of universal economic action versus the more targeted ones like reparations?
Well, we're in the midst of a new Great Depression in terms of unemployment, and it's not any one group of Americans that exclusively are suffering right now. I mean, if you look at New York City's real estate, I just saw a stat that it's 95% unoccupied, these commercial buildings. And so all of the pizza shops and coffee shops and like vendors that were relying upon people going to their office just to sell like a cinnamon roll to or whatever, like everyone is suffering right now. Like we need to try and put out the fire that has enveloped our economy, which right now, to me, the stimulus is headed backwards, where we've given 80% of it plus to large corporations and maybe 10% of it directly to families who are struggling right now. We should have reversed that. We should have put much more into households. There's a bill right now in Congress around emergency cash relief of $2,000 a month for families until this crisis is passed. To me, that's where we need to focus because the unemployment benefits are going to expire at the end of July. The moratorium on evictions from millions of apartments are going to end in August. We're going to see millions of Americans out on the street in desperate circumstances in the next number of days and weeks unless we take dramatic action right now.
Of course, any legislation and executive action is deeply entrenched in our politics. To that end, the president recently referred to COVID-19 as the Kung flu, a racial slur that I know that you called him out on. He also recently referred to racial justice protesters as hoodlums. I'm wondering, in a moment that America is clearly having a reckoning over race and privilege, whether you worry that the president's language and rhetoric will continue to have a lasting effect on America after he leaves office.
I believe that millions of Americans want us to come together. It's one reason why I believe Joe is going to soundly defeat Trump in November and that Joe will be our next president because we want to come together as a people. We want to begin healing. And we all know that Trump's racially divisive rhetoric has been part of the problem, not the solution. Right now, we're all desperate for a better approach. And I believe Joe Biden is going to be the person that leads this country over the next number of years to begin the healing process.
You've already started addressing some of the additional aid that you think Congress needs to give Americans in the face of these upcoming challenges that are still all related to coronavirus. In the current political climate, how likely do you think it is that Americans will receive the aid that they need?
I'm optimistic that Congress will see reason and do the right thing in terms of emergency cash relief. I saw a survey that said that the vast majority of Americans want cash relief, including a majority of Republicans. If you go to red states, they are suffering in the same ways that we all are suffering in terms of job loss and economic uncertainty on top of the pandemic. Cases are surging in many of those states. So I am optimistic that Congress is going to get more cash into Americans' hands because it's common sense. How are tens of millions of Americans going to get by if many of them can't go to their jobs? And it's bipartisan. So millions of Americans got the $1,200 stimulus in April, and it was a massive relief. We should be heading in that direction because the biggest problem with that $1,200 payment was that it just happened once. Households breathed a sigh of relief, but then thought, okay, what am I going to do next month and the month after that? So I am optimistic that Congress will do the right thing and pass cash relief very, very soon. Hopefully it'll be ongoing and repeated instead of just another one-time payment.
We spent some time on the trail together last year, and I want to harken back to that. You spoke a lot on the trail about automation and your fears for the future surrounding that. The current pandemic has a lot of people and a lot of working from home, or a lot of businesses adjusting operations because of the current crisis. How do you think the economic data from now bodes for our future jobs market?
Unfortunately, the concerns I had have been accelerated through this pandemic, where we're seeing 10 years worth of change in 10 weeks. And many of the people that are being kicked out of the job market right now are the people that have the least amount of savings or skills or flexibility to make a meaningful adjustment. Some of us are lucky that we can work remotely. But if you think about all of the security guards and nail salon workers and ushers and servers and bartenders, I mean, like for them, their job market is going to be depressed not just for weeks but for months and even years. So we need to think much bigger about how we're going to reform our economy to work for people that are going to not have any place in our job market in the coming days. One of the things I'm pushing Joe on really is that we need a relaunch America plan, where it's like a new deal or a Marshall Plan for the country. Because instead of saying, oh, if we can just get back to normal, we're going to get through this, we have to accept the fact that normal has changed forever. And if you think about your own experiences, unfortunately, we're all more excited about interacting with companies that don't have humans involved anymore, because the human is a potential risk factor. So if you had your pizza delivered by a Domino's self-driving car, instead of saying, wow, that's a little bit creepy, you're like, oh, good, I didn't have to interact with a person. Companies are doubling down in their investments in automation and doing more with fewer workers. You're seeing it too in the stock market prices, where these stock prices go up when they announce layoffs. And that's happening, unfortunately, all throughout the economy.
Has former Vice President Biden been open to those proposals that you have been floating his way?
And when I talked to Joe, he agrees that we need to think bigger about how we're going to make the economy work for more people. He understands the severity of the crisis that we're in, and he's very open-minded and pragmatic. Now, have I gotten him to commit to, a certain amount of money per month or something like that? No, but have I had conversations with him that make me very, very excited about the fact that we're going to be thinking bigger? Yes, I have.
I also wanted to ask about Martha McSally. She's a Republican from Arizona who is in a competitive Senate race right now for reelection. She introduced a bill that would give individuals and families a tax credit for travel, and I noticed that you retweeted some information about this. Are you supportive of that proposal?
I think it's a terrible idea to encourage travel during a pandemic, and I'd prefer cash to a tax credit. I retweeted it saying that this would be great if it was a staycation, where we should be paying people to stay home, not to travel. But I liked the fact that a Republican senator was suggesting getting more economic resources into people's hands, because that's really what we should be doing more and more of right now.
Switching tracks a little bit because you were the tech candidate. There are a lot of companies right now, like the North Face and Patagonia, that have made headlines for boycotting Facebook over content moderation. My question for you is whether you think this is a band-aid or a permanent solution.
I think that the fact that we're having this conversation speaks to how Facebook has been failing in its responsibility to Americans and consumers by refusing to take any responsibility for the kind of content it publishes. And I use the word publish very specifically because their stance has been, we are not a publisher, which if you look at it, you have to say that's ridiculous. They're the biggest media company in the world at this point, and they should take the same type of responsibility that Time or cable networks take, where if they repeat a political ad, they verify that it's true, and that they should have some standards and have the resources put in place where they can make judgments and determinations and then stand behind them. Saying we can't figure it out for a company of Facebook's wealth and expertise is just a giant cop out. And so the fact that there are advertisers who are trying to hold Facebook's feet to the fire because so many people are angry about Facebook's stance on this, to me it's something that is showing just how out of step Facebook's refusal to take responsibility is.
And I do have a question about your future. When are you announcing that you're running for mayor of New York City?
Well, thank you for the question. My focus is on helping Joe win right now and on helping our country get out of the deepest, darkest hole we've been in our lifetimes. 72% of Americans say right now is the darkest time in American history that they can remember. And we need to start digging our way out. We need to relaunch America. So that's where my focus is right now. But I will say it's incredibly gratifying to be thought of as someone who could help New York City turn around as well. I love New York City. Lived there for a long time, have very deep roots there. And I'm going to do everything I can to help New York City. But right now, to me, the biggest problems face the entire country. And we need to help Joe win and then start trying to figure out how to solve some of these problems.
I do have a question for you about Biden, but before I ask it, I want to ask one follow-up question, which is, are there any other offices that you're considering? And if so, which ones?
I'm naturally attracted more to executive type roles. I've been a CEO and I like to get things done. So those are roles that I'm drawn to. So that would be mayor, governor, president, obviously, which I ran for, and came up short. But those are the kinds of roles I'm naturally attracted to. There could be cabinet roles that also resemble that, and that I'm very passionate about the fact that we need to get our federal government caught up to technology issues where they're decades behind the curve. And some of these issues are having disastrous effects on our democracy, on our kids' mental health. So I recently launched an initiative around the use of our data. And if you look up, we're all clicking, I agree, I consent, when we get those privacy agreements from Facebook and the other companies. And now our data is being sold and resold for tens of billions of dollars a year. We're not seeing a dime of it. And it's corruptive to our democracy itself. So these are some of the issues that I'd love to help us address. And if I had a chance to do so in a Biden administration, I would be really excited to look at it.
Have you had conversations with presumptive Democratic nominee Biden over possibly joining his cabinet?
Oh, we've had general conversations about the fact that Joe would like me to play a role and be helpful. Yes.
Care to expand at all?
Uh, just that I'm driven to help Joe win, and I think that we're going to need all hands on deck to help clean up the historic crises that we're in the midst of. So that's a pretty political answer. It sounds terrible. I'm sorry. I apologize for sounding like a politician. This is awful. What has happened to Andrew Yang?
You spent
He
some
used to
time on
talk
the
like a human being. That's what happened to me, Lisa. It's true. You saw it. You saw it's like, wait a minute. That's not the Andrew Yang I remember from 2018 or whatever it was.
So I do want to ask you a little bit about this data dividend project that you just alluded to. As I understand it, you're basically seeking to unionize internet users and negotiate how much they're paid for their data. What is the underlying problem you think that this would fix?
We're taking advantage of the fact that California and Nevada have passed laws that give internet users the right to know what happens to our data, the right to opt out, the right to delete. And right now, tech companies are falling short on all of those fronts. And so the average consumer is completely in the dark as to what the heck to do. The average consumer is just clicking I agree and hoping for the best and then hoping nothing that terrible happens. So our goal is to activate consumers around their legal rights under these laws in California and Nevada, have those laws adopted nationwide. Because if you're in New York, you'll look up and say, wait a minute, people in California have rights to their data and I don't. And then you go to Albany and say, maybe you should just write that law. And I'm happy to say that New York is looking at emulating the California law. Washington is looking at emulating the California law. And so the goal is to activate the people around our data rights, get us paid for some of that value, because again, Facebook alone is profiting to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year off our data, and push better policies across the finish line, whether that's different states adopting a version of the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, or federal legislation. But I'm not the type to wait around and wait for legislatures to do the right thing, particularly when there are laws in the books that will enable us to help consumers right now get at least some proportion of that tens of billions of dollars that's being made off of our data every single year.
That's a great place to end things. Thank you so much for your time today and for taking the time to speak with us.